Just imagine Texas after this policy is introduced. If you told parents in Texas that the education system was going to teach their kids about morality, teach their kids how to view the world, it would not only rightfully beget suspicion, but it would fester distrust in the education system. And that has and the politicization of the education system has disastrous consequences. It means that education systems get defunded. It means that parents pull their kids out of school, and that is something that side affirmative will not stand for. Setup and then two arguments. On setup, the first thing I'm going to note is that this is not a policy debate, it's a preferred debate, which means that arguments that are made are about how education system will likely be implemented. But secondly, I would note that this debate is geographically ambiguous. It happens all over the world. It happens in India, where a deeply Hindu majoritarian party is in power. It happens in South Africa, where the ANC are glorified. It happens in America and in Rust Belt states, where people are deeply believe in religion, deeply believe in Catholicism and stuff like that. Cool, two arguments with it. My first argument will explain why this means that the education system gets far less funding and engagement. What this argument will essentially explain is that this policy will politicize the education system, which means you get less funding, which means you get less buy-in, which means that far less teachers are willing to go to the education system in the first place. Why is this true? The first thing I'll explain in this argument is why what is taught will be politicized. Firstly, there is an incentive to do this for two reasons. Firstly, just by doing this, it means that you can mold the future voter base that will vote for you in the future. For example, if you teach people that what is important is, tend into your local community, that fosters support for protectionist policy and tariffs in the United States. But second of all, there often exists lobbying within the party from these groups. For example, parent groups or Christian rights group that says our kids should be taught these morals in this way. And stuff like sexuality is something that is gross to talk about. Kids should not talk about it in school. They should not be aware of it. Obviously, side negative might make the response that this can get backlash, but I would explain that parties care far more about support and voices within their parties as a voice within outside of it, because they care about securing swing states and stuff like that there. But secondly, the second part of this argument, and secondly, there exists a capacity to do so. Because morality is something that is broad in nature. It is so easy to sneak in political ideology via many different means. And it has been done, before. But the second part of this argument will explain, more importantly, that even if what is taught isn't politicized, people will think it is anyways. And this is true for two reasons. Firstly, media groups can fearmonger people, can scare them into believing what these people teach at school is insane. It is not what hardcore traditional values, what you were brought up with. It is the woke left agenda. But second of all, I would explain that people are already distrustful of states. They buy into anti-established narratives. And the reason is because the state has hurt these people in the past before. Economic failures and bailouts from banks and negligence has hurt people before in the past in a way that means they are deeply resentful towards the state. They buy into anti-established narratives, and when you tell them that the state is taking control over the morals that will be taught to their kids, people are deeply opposed to it. If you believe that these education systems are politicized, or people will view it as such, this has a series of very important impacts. The first one is that parents are far less willing to let their kids go to school in the first place. They become distrustful of the education system. Or even if they do allow them to go in kindergarten or later year 6, in older years they make them pull out of school in year 10 or year 9 far earlier than they would have to in the first instance. But second of all, we would explain that you get a decrease in the amount of teachers that are willing to teach at schools. This is true for three reasons. Three reasons. Firstly, because you're teaching moral stuff as well as academic stuff, it means that you have more things to do in the first place, which means you have a greater workload. Second of all, I would explain that teachers can get backlash. For example, if kids go to school, hear about morality or teaching from their teacher, and then go back home to their parent who has told them that you should be deeply suspicious of these groups, whereas schools have told them, you should be empathetic and kind even towards trans people. That is something that, makes parents talk to their teachers, puts a lot of pressure on teachers, and that is particularly bad there. But thirdly, I would explain that because there are more people capable of teaching morality, what that means is that there are more people in the labor market, and if supply of teachers increases, the wage goes down, because that's basic supply demand economics, which means that if wages go down for teachers, far less people become willing to do this in the first place, which explains why you get a decrease in the number of teachers that are willing to teach. And that is disastrous. We need teachers to teach in our schools. Teaching shortages means that teachers are overworked. Less teachers are willing to go to school in the future. The third impact is that you get defunding for schools. Like, just imagine Texas after this policy. It is like, the golden egg for politicians to go and defund the education system to say it is not worthwhile. And that means that students have access to far less laptops, far less access to laboratory equipment, far less access to online learning infrastructure that betters the education of these kids. But fourthly, I would explain that sometimes it can just teach incredibly bad stuff, or stuff that is bad for kids in the first place. For example, telling kids to be selfless in a society like South Korea, where people overwork themselves and don't focus on themselves, means that it's bad for these people and the way that they go about their lives. That explains our argument there. My second argument will explain why you get better educational outcomes. The first part of this argument will explain is why educational outcomes are important. What I would note is that schools don't only teach math, philosophy, but they also teach stuff like agriculture, policy making, commerce classes where you learn about the makeup of the legal system, as well as how banks work, loan, financial literacy. Why are they important? Firstly, they teach you skills to improve your material circumstances. This is true for two reasons. Firstly, they teach you skills that jobs require, for example, coding. But secondly, on a day-to-day basis, it also helps you. Having financial literacy means you make the right choices and don't take out unwise loans. Knowing how to diversify in economics or commerce class means that you have a wise and balanced investment portfolio. But secondly, that explains that there. But secondly, I would explain that it is also important for the overall economic development of smaller countries, because these countries often have skill shortages, and it is crucial that these people are able to do that there. That explains the first part of the argument. The second part of this argument will explain that there is a significant trade-off between teaching academics as well as holistic stuff. And the simple reason is because if you want to teach this stuff very well, you do need to dedicate time, you do need to dedicate resources to it, making teaching supplies, worksheets for kids to talk about, dedicating times in classrooms to have discussions. The third part of this argument will explain is that our benefit is mutually exclusive to their benefit. What that means is that we can get their benefit, but they can't get ours. Why is this true? Firstly, I would explain that parents in a lot of circumstances have quite poor education, and the simple reason for this is because education is increasing over time. Whereas stuff like morality, it's hard for you to pinpoint where your kid is going wrong academically if you don't have enough education about English or you don't know how to write a good essay. Whereas morality is something that is easy for people to understand. They're taught it from a young age. There are many experiences where they have to talk with people in their lives and make moral decisions. They have many people that they've learned this from. Explain that parents are better at teaching morality compared to economics. But second of all, I would explain that it maximizes the comparative advantage of teachers, because now they split their responsibility half and half. Whereas if you tell them to focus on education, they can maximize their comparative advantage there. But thirdly, I would explain that academic subjects often implicitly teach you how to do stuff. For example, philosophy and history exposes you to many diverse cultural perspectives and many different diverse moral frameworks, which informs these kids' decisions, whereas you don't get it the other way around. That explains that it is our side to get far better educational outcomes. Finally, they might make the claim that these educational outcomes are good and important. I would weigh this argument as a judge quite lowly for three reasons. Firstly, it is an uncertain benefit, because it is unclear what is subjectively right or wrong. There are so many different perspectives, whereas education is something that is concrete. But second of all, it is not large of a benefit in scale, because we can co-opt their benefit, but they can't co-opt ours. Explain that the severity of the harm isn't large and should be weighed quite lowly in the debate.
Panel, I ask of you a single question. I ask you to consider who is in charge of running schools, who is setting the educational agenda, and the response to that question is a logical, rational, highly qualified actor. I want to make it very clear that education exists in an incredibly professional domain, but also in a financial and business domains. Under the status quo, and in our world as well, regardless of any world that exists, education is something that fundamentally needs engagement. The administrators of these industries know this. As an educator, you know that your school needs to be successful. So I ask then, at what point can the affirmative team continue their claim that this will be so unpopular that schools will defund, when knowing a logical admin of a school, or like a logical administrator of a school, just isn't going to operate into a system that is going to defund them? Rather, what I will explain to you throughout this speech is that holistic education has a high potential benefit to the students that does not have to engage with the allegations of politicization that they have noted. So a few things in this speech, a few points on setup on like what holistic education actually looks like, noting here that affirmative team left it very vague, and then 2 points of like substantive on why we get better students socially and why we get better engagement in a school context. So just to begin on setup, number one, what actually is holistic education? I just want to note here, we don't hear very explicit examples from the affirmative team of what this is likely to teach. So what does then moral instruction realistically looks like? It probably looks like engaging directly in moral debate in school settings. It actually looks like having conversations about things like abortion, things like this. They want to tell us that in America this is particularly dangerous, but I think in a world where it is the norm, you probably avoid situations like this, and in a world where it is already the norm, I think it falls out of this debate, a school in such a dictatorial setting where you have intense scrutiny of an education system. I just don't think regular ideas about how education should run can be applied to them. Rather, what I tell you more broadly in general society, for most of the world, this probably looks like engaging with debates, probably also just team building and socializing. It probably looks like just decentering success and probably focusing more holistically on building connections with your peers, with people around you. And I also want to note here, it's probably just really explicit on these things, under the status quo in academic stuff. A lot of this is happening just really implicitly without any teachers actually pushing it. So I also want to note, it is massive for the community. You are engaging with local issues, consequently probably getting involved. And note here, you are highly much more likely to have a less prescriptive curriculum. You are probably going to see a more focus on students' interests and what is actually engaging them, which will have several benefits, which I will step out later. But then it has to be asked, what does prioritizing holistic education actually look like? Number one, let's note, you're still going to be meeting baseline developmental and academic requirements. At no point are we going to be entirely deprioritizing academic success. That is something that is symmetric to both sides of the house. Rather, the change is prioritizing non-academic, holistic engagements with broader society, which I will tell you, and we will tell you down the bench, has a benefit to your academic success. Just a small note here, exit rankings for things like uni admission are probably going to be symmetrical and take into account whatever education system is functioning. Finally, I want to tell you exactly why this is going to be done well. Number one, they tell you that this is going to be bad for teachers. Instead, I'm going to flip this and say that it's very good for teachers because the holistic education system has a very low threshold for engagement. What this means is that really all you need is good instruction and resources to be able to engage holistically. This looks like things as simple as doing team building activities. A first year education student can run that happily. This doesn't look like every single teacher needs to be a specialist, and in a world with holistic education, we're probably getting more engagement from other community sources, from other people, because number two, you are able to rely on local structures under a holistic model of education. This has an immense benefit because things like charities are just going to get more buy-in on our side of the world. But number three, I'm going to tell you that it's just easy to move teachers around in this world because we have less of a reliance on specialist knowledge and precise professional accreditation. We'll still have that, obviously, but because it's probably just a broader focus on what can we deliver to students, we're probably just going to get teachers moving around. Secondly, you'll just have norms because governments have a norm and incentive to support education in the mode that works best, and as I will tell you now, this is clearly what works best. So, on to my first point of substantive, which is why we get better students in a social context. So I just want to frame this really quickly in the current world we are in, where students are becoming quite scary, to be honest. What this looks like is individualism is massively on the rise. Young people we know are vulnerable to extreme ideologies, and thirdly, they have a really high engagement with social media. When you put this all together, you see a very dangerous susceptibility to algorithmic influence, and then what this results in is the massive rise of neo-misogyny, of Andrew Tate listening young boys who are directly racist, who are misogynist, who are homophobic. This is massively on the rise from previous years, and presumably is only going to get worse, and is a significant problem for society. And if you go to any educational admin, this is one of the most important issues in this world. So why then do we actually get better social outcomes? And I'm going to give you three mechanisms for this. Number one, we just teach the necessary skills of community care, because under the counterfactual systems just reward competition. That AF wants to live in a world where their system doesn't have flaws, but I'm here to tell you that an academic-only system rewards a very specific type of performance, which is necessarily competitive and necessarily encourages people to be competitive because it equates academic performance with success. Number two, I'm going to explain that this forces contact with local communities and social issues. This looks like people going out and engaging with their community, which is just always going to A, be a net good, B, they're probably just going to be more aware, and C, they're just going to be able to build empathy as a result. I want to note here, under the counterfactual, their world, you just have a very limited incentive to build empathy. This is how you end up in situations like Texas, because these people see the world in a non-holistic mode. But when you understand this through an education system that gives you a solid incentive to build empathy, you are more likely to have it. Number three, this is the actual mechanism for how you build empathy, but you are just rewarding empathy and social engagement. You are basically classically conditioning kids by telling them, hey, empathy is good, empathy is something we should care about. So in a world where we actually prioritize and focus on holistic education, we get more empathy. Now, on to impacting this. Number one, we probably just get more social conscious. We get people voting better, we get people having like an incentive to participate more because they are given the resources to know how to participate and why they should participate, like in their education system, something currently lacking in ours. Number two, they're probably just going to be nicer people in their day-to-day lives. Number three, they'll just feel better about themselves. I want to note here that, again, the current school system is leaving children behind. They're left with mental health issues. They're left being extremely racist and sexist. But in our world, we just get in that like they have a better school experience. They're able to do things that are more engaging. Now, on to weighing it. I think like number one, this is a huge scale. This is every student. Number two, I think like implicitly, people who are vulnerable are additionally much more harmed by schools, which is why like it's really important to focus on them. On to my second point, which is why we just get better engagement in schools. Number one, there's a lower barrier to success and reward. Doing well in academics requires a very like long list of things that I'm not going to list. And like this is very narrow, but also dependent on kids and students like just having the privilege to be able to do this. Number two, like it's probably just more fun. People are engaged when they're having fun. That's just like a basic rule of academic educational practice. It's active, direct, and also applicable to the real world. Students are just going to be more engaged because they're having fun, but seeing it in the real world. Noting again here that the counterfactual is just a stressful environment with things like an over-prioritization on tests and just like an urban design and ecology of schooling that is just unfun. You sit in a room all day, you don't like actually get much engagement. In our world, kids are going out there experiencing. So number three, just like you're more adaptable for specific classes. And number four, like minority groups are probably just going to be more connected to their world. All of this is incredibly beneficial. Onto what the actual impacts of this here. Number one, this probably gives students an increased capacity to focus on academics. Number two, it's easier behavior management for students, for teachers to do to their students because they're having fun. Note this like happens in the context of a teacher crisis. Number three, students have better mental health. Overall, like this is just weighed very high on vulnerability and again scale. And all of these reasons to go together show very clearly why like holistic education should be prioritized and why I'm so proud to again. Thank you.
To defend against discrimination and oppressive narratives, you usually need a higher level of education. One side trades off that level of education for people to tell you what you should believe, rather than teaching you how to believe and come to your own circumstances. We are the side that maximizes agency by giving people the tools to understand things and the things happening around them, rather than baby feeding them what they should believe, which we explain is often the wrong things to believe anyway. Three things in the speech. First, on education funding. Second, on the holistic stuff. And third, on the level of education outcomes and then we'll weigh them against each other. Let's first start with education funding. The first thing I'm going to do here is explain that education funding comes from a series of different actors. It comes from different levels of government, so sometimes curriculum is set by the school board, but in the US, funding comes from local councils as well as the federal government. Australia comes from federal and state governments. In most constituencies, there are different levels of government doing it. So the people setting the curriculum, not always the same people funding it. So that explains why they have different interests and are likely to defund each other. But secondly, it sometimes comes from parental contributions. This isn't always private or religious schools, but optional parental voluntary contributions to state schools in most circumstances that parents can opt out of, decreasing the amount of funding for education sources. But thirdly, and most importantly, I think it comes from places like foreign aid and non-governmental organizations and charities that do lots of education funding for places in the developing world. And they are likely to not fund things when they see them as political, potentially having blowback and reducing the amount of funding that they have. They fund more certain things instead, meaning that we lose funding there. That means at the end of that, you believe it comes from a variety of different sources. That means you only have to believe that one of them gets a little bit annoyed, and that means education funding is able to decrease. The team has to do heaps of mitigation to be able to link this argument. But I don't think any mitigation really works, because a 1% decline in education funding is incredibly impactful. That means you have to cut a teacher at every school. It means class sizes go up. And maybe that means that someone's score gets a little bit lower, they don't get as much attention to them. One extra kid falls behind. That's massively monumental on those people. We don't say it's 1%, we say it's much larger, but in response to any potential mitigation in the future, still is not enough for this team to be able to win the debate. They have to deal with the claim by itself. But I think the next thing what they will to explain is defending against the mitigation if they're like, well, you still politicize a little bit because we saw a little bit of the moral stuff. Two responses to this. Firstly, I think it gets far less attention because the set of narratives both sides agree or politicize it. Things like saying, oh, they're coming for our kids, they're controlling our kids, could not be true when you're doing like a little bit of it. You have to do a lot of it to do the controlling stuff, rather than only being able to do a little bit of it. But secondly, I'd say when you're doing less of the moral stuff, just gets less attention, is the more basic level morals rather than the more controversial ones. You probably start at the base level and branch out to different ones, rather than just starting at the most controversial level. That explains that we're far less likely to get that politicization, defend against that mitigation. Let's go through the mitigation that they actually give. They say it doesn't annoy people because it's now the norm to do this thing. Two responses. Firstly, people often object to norms. You don't need everyone to object to the norm, but if one person objects, that decreases funding. Secondly, it's not that like the norm is to teach people about abortion. It's the norm is to talk about holistic specifically. People can disagree with the way you do the holistic stuff, and that's the argument we make. Is that if you go exactly pro-choice, the pro-life people will defund it. If you go pro-life, the pro-choice people will defund it. That's how you get the set of education funding. Are we going to keep going? Yeah, cool. Okay, that explains that you only need to annoy one set of people. It wasn't that they were annoyed by the system, but they were annoyed by what you're doing with the system. They say it's likely to be set by smart people, and that means they're unlikely to do it in ways that defund it. Our team absolutely agrees. That's why the vast majority of education systems around the world are not your side. They're the ones we pick, because they're chosen by smart people who don't want their education system to be defunded. And the set of people that are, maybe they are still smart, but they have other sets of reasons, they're incredibly ideological, they set the religious curriculums that do often get defunded by the state, that should imply to you that our argument is able to stand and does occur in that way, because it has in the past. That set of reasons explains that education funding goes down, and it goes down by quite a lot. But even if it went down by a little bit, that's still a large impact that we're able to weigh in this debate. Let's next go over the way that holistic education works. I'm going to start with a flip, explain why they're likely to be probably bad ideas that you're propagating. So even if you believe the kids believe them, that is harmful. Just 3 reasons for this. The first one is often schools are run by religious groups and organizations that often have bad ideas that are choice denying rather than choice maximizing. And note even things like state schools often have religious offices within them. In New South Wales, there was a chaplaincy program funded by the Turnbull government that meant that there was a school chaplain in every state school. Often they have connections with them that are occurring in those ways, and I think that those can just be quite indoctrinating to the kids, because they believe these people are meant to be impartial and then they do these sets of things to them. But secondly, I'd say that school boards are more likely to be conservative than progressive, which defeats the material they get. The structural reason that school boards are more progressive than conservative is because think about the narrative that makes you, that school boards have low levels of like political engagement, not many people run for them, they don't think they're that important, not many people vote for them. So think about the narrative that persuades you to want to vote more. They are coming for our kids, or we should tell our kids to be happy and be choice maximizing. Obviously the set of people think they're coming for our kids, they're coming to get them, they're coming to try and persuade them these bad things. Those are the sets of people that are going to run and argue on these boards. Those are the most likely to be radicalized people. Maybe they'll be like, oh, but left-wing people also think they're coming for our kids, but those are also the most radicalized left-wing people that will also give bad ideas. So that explains that the most radicalized people are just setting the curriculums and doing these in bad ways. We should not let them be able to do that. But the third and structural reason is just that it's the majority group setting these curriculums about what it means to be polite. It's often set by men that are telling women how they have to be more polite and that would be better for them. I think that's a terrible way to do it. The sets of people they explain doing it are likely to propagate bad ideas. That means even if you believe all their stuff, the kids believe it, they engage with it well, they do all this, their bad ideas they're engaging with, that is a harm, defeats all their material. But let's explain, even if they have good or bad ideas, that the process of engaging with these ideas just makes all the kids in the room feel bad. 3 reasons. Firstly, is because some of these kids have gone through these problems and having to watch their classmates discuss them is just incredibly abhorrent for them. For the girl in the class that's gone through abortion and then has to walk out of the room because she feels uncomfortable and is now disclosed to everyone in the class that is a situation which makes her feel uncomfortable. It is incredibly awful for that woman. She should not have to put through that because this team thinks they're going to make schools better. But secondly, sometimes you just don't agree with the teacher. The teacher is saying things you disagree with. That makes you uncomfortable, even if your opinion is somewhat wrong despite it being subjective. I would say that that is an uncomfortable position to have to be in. Obviously, it's like far better to disagree with a teacher on a maths equation to disagree with them on fundamental morals. That's less likely to annoy you. But thirdly, I'd say your classmates can just confront you with horrific stuff. When discussing homophobia and saying homophobia is bad, you have to hear the classmate that you thought was a nice guy and was nice to you say homophobic things. That is just incredibly bad to have to put the kids through. We should not utilize them to try and make these kids more progressive. We're putting them through the harm that we don't have to engage with. The last thing that they give on me on this is they're like, oh, but you can engage with the community more. I think we're able to flip this because engagement with community from kids only comes when their parents push them to do it. But we explain that the parents have a time trade-off. Well, they do more of the academic stuff because their kid is falling behind and not meeting the requirements. And when you do that, you have less time to be able to convince your kid to go out and engage with the community when you have to be doing more of the academic tutoring side of things. We are able to flip that. We explain that we get comparative advantage. Parents do the community stuff with the kid. The school is able to do the academic stuff. But let's go into why the schools get far worse. Well, the thing I'm going to explain here is that why there's a massive time sink and trade-off, so they can't claim that both benefits are the same. I think the reason for this is if you want to do what they're saying well, you want to write these curriculums well, you have to do a massive amount of consulting, talking to people, changing all the time, checking in with the parents, your kid was okay with what happened today, making sure everyone is fine. That takes so much more time than it takes to teach your kids a maths curriculum that you don't have to consult with the parent body on. That means even if you're spending half your time doing holistic stuff, that takes up 75% of a teacher's time. It means they're trading off far more of the time they could be spending doing the academic stuff, and it is just far worse. The comparative maths curriculums don't take us long. Their only response to this is, well, this affects everyone, so on the exit rankings, everyone goes down, so just comparatives, it's no worse. I don't think that responds to the claim you make. 3 responses. I think the first one is that it can happen for your country if employ less people in your country. So if a country adopts its education system, less people there are likely to be employed because that country is seen as having a bad education system. But secondly, I know it just makes the world less productive, which means less things are getting produced, which means there's less goods get more expensive. It's harder to employ people because we don't have as much demand for it because we're not producing as much. But thirdly, I would say maybe this is true that some people are able to gain these systems, but I'd say it just increases the inequality in accessing these rankings because you get a tutor outside of school. That's so much more beneficial for you when they're so much more beneficial for you when when they're doing less education in the class. Makes a much more of a massive difference to you. That explains why they would do that. They say you still meet the baseline requirements. We're barely meeting them now. We're definitely not going to meet them on your side. Proud to affirm.
Panel, if you divide this team's case, you need to buy that schools under our side of the house will do this extremely poorly and be extremely politicised, while simultaneously believing that academics under the status quo, where there's a focus on doing really well academically, getting a really high ATAR score, is a perfect system that isn't debilitating to many kids, that doesn't stress many kids out, and that doesn't leave many kids behind not getting the benefits they claim. I think that is very clearly not true, and this is very clearly a neg ballot. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the sort of funding and the engagement question, which they try prop. Then I'm going to talk to you why we get better academic outcomes. Finally, I'll prove to why we get more societal outcomes, which is clearly the most important issue in this debate. But firstly, let's talk about engagement and funding. Because this is I think their key claim, which is to say that because this is going to be political, it means that people are going to defund these institutions and they become worse. First response I'd make to this is I think their explanation explains why this is unlikely. Because they point out to you, many people have massive incentives for school not to be political. It is generally the overplaying opinion that they shouldn't be political. And that explains to you why many people will backlash and have been backlashing under the fact that they will be political. Second thing we tell you is we give you a more reasonable outline of what this is likely to look like. It's like taking away your academic classes and replacing with them classes that misogyny is bad and it is a prevailing issue on social media. It's taking our classes about maths and humanities at a young age, and it's going to the old age home and getting the kids to talk with the teachers. These are the things we tell you at Barrie. But 3, we would outline at the point at which these teams tell you to incentives that is likely to be unpopular. And what we outline in this debate is likely to be extremely popular. Like many people from an old age community would love young kids to come to their school. It explains to you why our model is comparatively more likely. And even if for some instances there would be, politicized, there will be backlash which will stop it being politicized and things will move to our side. But 4, their preempt at first to this point makes sort of no sense because they say that swing voters won't like our side of the house. But I think what we do in our side of the house, which is teaching based on moral things and not being political, as we explained to you earlier, is the most likely outcome since clearly populists are, swing voters. I think the last thing they say is, I think this deals with their claims about taxes and things, about how they're losing money. Because I don't think there is an incentive for, to defund these. Because that's the 4th claim. Sorry. It's because education is so important, because many people have a value for education and they want their kids to be in education because they believe that the societal norm that it is something that is necessary. It explains to you why many parents and institutions are still going to fund schools even if they're unhappy with them. Which explains to you, even if you believe people are really upset with these institutions and want to defund them, defunding won't be the first step. Backlashing, calling these out, protesting college boards will be the steps that become for the defunding. We think that happens first, and then even if we get this bad scenario, it gets pushed away. But the final thing is they say is that parents are going to sort of teach their kids bad ideals, or they'll be against what the schools are teaching them. But I think they never really explain why this is particularly harmful. Because I think it would probably be better, even if you have a parent that is conservative, that you learn at school about transgender rights and these other issues. If we get in this debate and people learn about these things through the avenues, I think that's a comparative benefit. Because what we tell you at Barrie, which is that many people have really bad ideas under the status quo, they get taught these things by their parents, and they're never challenged through schools. That means they grow up and continue to have these bad ideas. But I would flip this once more and say, I think the reason we actually win engagement is because what mechanisms we tell you as Riley, which go largely under-responded to. That is to say that one, when you're doing things that are more social, when you're being active, you're likely to have more fun in school, and you're probably going to be more engaged overall. Secondly, these things feel more purposeful because you can see the impact, where when you're studying biology, you're not really sure what the point of this, which is likely why you're able to unengage on their side of the house. And four, we just think we create a better environment because people think about misogyny more, they think about racism more, they think about treating other more from a very young age. Because we teach these things at a young age where they prioritize numeracy, we get these people acting better and the environment we get later on is better. That's important because maybe you believe that this team gets a slight benefit, but I don't think they ever managed to prove to you that this is going to be extremely harmful, which explains to you at the point at which we get more engagement from students on our side of the house, when we do these things, we get a benefit in this debate, which they don't. Let's talk about academic outcomes. What are their claims? I think their first claim is to say that teachers will have more work. First response, we obviously deprioritize academic classes in the large sense. We think that's because there's an over-prioritization of the status quo. But it's unclear where this overload comes from. We're doing less of that and more of this. But secondly, holistic education is far more easy to teach because you don't have to study one specific topic and get good at it. So we think younger age teachers can teach this really well and it isn't hard to learn. Three, they said parents can do community stuff. I think taking you to an old age home. I think that probably doesn't make sense because parents don't have the resources to do a lot of those things. It's far more easy if you do them through the schools, which is what we get. Final and biggest claim is that you get worse academic outcomes. But I would flip this for a couple of reasons. First reason, I think many kids don't actually currently get a good education because they're disengaged with the system, or two, because not picking the specific courses that this scheme prompts to, like commerce. But three, we obviously still get some academic programs because obviously at a young age we take away some of them, but as we pointed out, kids are still doing ATAR, you just have probably less ATAR and more focus on these courses. And that explains to Riley why there's often the majority of students are still going to know how to count and read. That is not what changed in this debate. And I think that takes out a lot of their certainty mechanisms because I think we get that ball. But three, I would flip it and I tell you that our kids are better at academics because over-prioritization is extremely harmful under the status quo. So many students are extremely burned out for two reasons. One, the system is inherently competitive. Because you have ATAR rankings, they're pushed to work hard to get a high result. But two, because the norm is this is all about education. So if you're at school and you're not studying hard, you're wasting your time. That's impactful for three reasons. One, because of burnout. Two, because these students have increased anxiety. And three, because they're sabotaged, because people are competing against each other. Academics is worse when there's this over-prioritization. We step back from that. We have less academics, and we think it's actually better. The impact of that is clear. One, we're still likely going to get the most necessary things in this debate. But three, we debunk their claims about why this current system is good. The current system is extremely bad for a lot of students, and we put this over. Let's finally talk about, the final issue, which is the one we are clearly ahead on, which is people being better people in general. What are their claims here? First claim, it's bad to be selfish. I think their example, firstly, proves how their comparative is far worse. The example is South Korea. It proves to the people working way too hard academically and over-prioritizing academics. It leads to burnout and it's extremely hard for them. But secondly, we explained to you why there is currently a problem of individualism, which is propagated through social media. This needs to be dealt with because people are way too selfish under the status quo. We make that shift at a young age. Secondly, they say school boards are likely to be conservative. And I think there's a bit of back and forth because we give you some claims about what they're likely to be progressive, they give you some claims about what they'll be conservative. This is how I'm going to break the deadlock. Look at what's happening in the US currently. Trump, who is very clearly conservative and not progressive, is backlashing against a ton of schools because he doesn't like what they're teaching. That explains to you why a lot of these schools are progressive and they're teaching probably actually quite good morals. But three, we tell you that likely some of these things already exist under the status quo. Catholic schools have a focus on academics, still do a lot of these things. We think on a broader societal shift, we get much more schools that are teaching the good things because now the public schools sort of teach morals and they're likely to do this in a better way, which is explained to you why the change that we get is better. But finally, they tell you that this helps, on their side of the house, they help you understand what to believe in. But one, you probably do philosophy on either sides of the house, because as we said, we're not taking away data. But two, what we get at a younger age is we get people being more empathetic, because there is classes about cleaning the school, there's classes about picking up trash, there's classes about going to a community age and talking with old people. That's what we get in this debate. Why is that so impactful? I think firstly, because people are more prepared for the future because they get better social skills on our side of the house, which are lacking under the status quo. Secondly, they just feel more happy, they feel more engaged in school. And three, they give back to communities, which is a massive benefit this team David deals with. Think about how happy people in an old age home are going to be when their students come visit them. This is way the highest in the debate. This impacts so many more people, and because their impacts about academic are actually really uncertain. So proud to oppose.
my speech with the most charitable conception of this negative team's case, which is they claim that this teaches people to be good people. We give a series of responses that knocks this out of order. Firstly, parents and community actors already do this, and if children do not engage with actors like their own parents, they had a biological connection to, they lived in the same home, ate and worked and played in the same house, they were unlikely to listen to teachers who they felt disconnected to, and clearly had no moral or sort of biological ownership over them. But secondly, we explained that this conception of what is a good person is deeply subjective and unclear. Like even the examples of the emphasise, which are very, very charitable for this team, stuff like de-emphasise, de-emphasis on the individual for the community, is just out to test a harm for many communities. In places like South Korea and China, individuals are worked to death, supporting their families, are worked to death because of the pressures that are beholden to them, because of the patriarchal culture that they are expected to be beholden to. Individuals were important of their own right. We supported an educational system that educated individuals and taught them about the worldviews, about the different moral philosophies that they could ascribe to, rather than making individuals fit into one. We're never prouder to propose. The first question I'm going to ask in this speech is the question on funding and buy-in, because I think it's the most important. We told you that there was a series of reasons as to why there was increased politicization, and this meant a lot of backlash. They give you a series of responses. They say firstly that educators are run by national actors and like logical, high qualified administrators. But firstly, Will explains that there are a diversity of sources, things like parent contribution, things like, for example, private actors, in which a point substantially applies. And I'll note when Lockie says that backlash, they'll do backlash first, like parents withholding their parent contributions is the form of backlash, which is obviously devastating for funding, right? But secondly, I don't think it's true that school bureaucrats do control the way in which schools teach us more instruction. I know that, for example, empirically, the school wars in Texas and Florida are dominated by partisan politicians who don't care about, for example, logic, or don't care about rationality. They only want to stir up shit. They don't care about backlash from the other side of the party. They don't care about backlash from the Democrats, because that backlash is actually really good for them, right? It shows to the Republican Party, to the conservative lobbyists and the donors that they are really, gung-ho and Republican and conservative. But thirdly, even if none of this is true, I think our point still applies in cases where there's a majority party or a majority ethnic group imposing this moral instruction on a minority ethnic group or a minority religious group, because it means that this minority of people now buy out of the educational system. They forsake all of the educational and even moral benefits that schooling provides, and this is devastating. This is debate winning. The next claim they give is that, they walk back on their burden and they say it'll be done well. For example, they'll only talk about misogyny or talking about how it's a good person. But I'll note that second negative knifes their first negative, because second negative says it won't be political, whereas first negative says it'll be stuff like abortion or stuff about trans rights. The question for third negative then is which one of their team members is wrong. But secondly, I note that even at their best, talking about stuff like misogyny is just very controversial, because it's very, very close to this idea of masculinity, sort of infringing on what is the idea to be a good man. I think even, for example, conservative parents do not want kids to do not want their teachers telling their kids that masculinity is inherently bad or is inherently evil. And I think that even their best examples are quite controversial. The next thing they say is that people really value education and they won't defund it. But firstly, education is less important when you can actually do less of the education stuff and you do more of the moral philosophizing stuff, right? I think that people actually care about autonomy and they care about control rather than just simple education. But I think secondly, they really don't really value education that much at all, because they think it is they deeply mistrust the state. They view it as a form of state propaganda. Abrar gives you a series of responses, none of which are responded to. The next thing they say is that teachers there's a lower barrier to entry for teachers, because under our side they need specialist knowledge, whereas on their side they only need to do team building. The first response I give is that this is flipped, right? Because now under their side, teachers now have to have a certain level amount of expertise or specialist knowledge, and also have to be a child psychologist or an interpersonal expert and know how to navigate group dynamics, right? That is an added layer of burden, not a simple substitute, right? Because on their side, teachers have to do both. On our side, teachers can only specialize and maximize the comparative advantage in one, right? The next thing but I think secondly, it isn't just team building that these teachers are expected to do, right? And I'll know that academic collaboration and group work and projects is largely symmetric. I don't think it's team building that this team is obviously supporting, right? Obviously, academic collaboration is something we can support as well. And I've flipped this, right? Because moral instruction is a profoundly high barrier of entry to overcome for teachers. Imagine a Muslim teacher being expected to teach Judeo-Christian values to their class, or a Kurdish teacher being expected to teach, for example, students how to teach students to be, loyal and nationalistic to the Turkish nation state. This is deeply, deeply alienating. This is a harm in and of itself, and it means that these teachers don't even enter the system in the first place. Comparatively, traditional academics is just about facts. It is is just about academic discourse, not about matters of morality or about politics, which is deeply, deeply alienating to these people. And notably, even if you believe none of that, none of their rebuttal actually responds to our most important and most potent mechanism, which is that even if these administrators don't actually politicize the school system, it will just be perceived as incredibly political, which means that, for example, parents pull their kids out of the school system and now start homeschooling them. It means that, for example, there is increased public pressure to do things like vote for politicians who say they'll defund the Department of Education. This was incredibly bad. And on the weighing of this, the reason I spent so much time on this issue is because it is incredibly logically upstream of anything else in this debate. For either team to claim any benefits, they need to prove why funding actually gets better. We prove that funding decreases. We actually win, because even obviously if funding improves on their outside, we have more capacity to do both of what they're talking about. Obviously, they need to win this issue to win the debate. The next question I'm going to ask is about socializing, right? Because they say that individualism is on the rise and social media is really, really bad. I think firstly, woefully untrue for them to claim that students are now equipped against bad social media influences like Andrew Tate. Because if young boys love Andrew Tate and schools and so much, and schools teach him that he's bad, Andrew Tate will just tell his young audience that not to listen to their schools, not to listen to their teachers, but they're all part of the deep state, right? Deeply unclear as to why this is an effective mechanism. But secondly, as I flagged in my introduction, I think parents and communities are far better actors to teach stuff like not to be misogynistic, right? Because firstly, parents have a direct moral and biological ownership over their kids. They are far more familiar with their kids, and they can notice when their kids are acting misogynist, for example. But I think, okay, the next claim is to say that academic focus breeds a stressful environment of competition. But I'll flip this, right? Because it's even more and more stressful for these kids, because these academic rankings and this academic competition exists on either side of the house. On either side, you still have to do a test at the end of your schooling career. But on your side, now 50% of your time is spent doing bullshit moralistic teaching, whereas you could be spending that time doing, for example, maths that lets you actually be prepared for those exams. On your side, students are far less prepared and they're far more stressed out. Inequality becomes entrenched because students who now have the means to be educated outside of the schooling system through private coaching now has an added advantage because schools become less effective. The next say that engagement in community is good. As I noted in my introduction, this is a very speculative benefit. I don't even think community is a benefit that they've proven to be definitive. I don't think that they can claim this. Okay, the last question I'm going to ask is about the question of traditional academics, right? Because we said that this is incredibly bad for traditional academics for a bunch of reasons. They said that, you have to still meet, baseline academics, or, like school exit systems taken into account. But this is mitigation at best, because our most destructive claim was the fact that developing countries who are far, far poorer than most of the contexts in which this team tried to engage with just needed skills. They needed students who were efficient and adept at things like irrigation, or things like engineering, or things like science to build the economy, to build the fucking country. This was the most important claim in this debate, because it meant that whole countries got ruined and devastated by lack of skills, by lack of schools that taught these kids actual important skills that meant students could do valuable work in their communities and build their countries up economically, could rise themselves up from poverty. The next attempt at responding to this is that kids still learn how to do academic stuff, but currently they're overworked and disengaged. Firstly, they're more disengaged on your side because these classes are deeply uncomfortable and deeply alienating and deeply boring and moralizing. But secondly, I think that they're not overworked under our side. Counselors exist under our side. Parents have an incentive to make sure that schools don't overwork them. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
There are a set of attributes and traits that schools can teach you that are relatively value neutral, but are incredibly useful and socially productive. Things like charity, things like empathy, things like trust in people, things like critical thinking, all of which get done far better on neg. Because as much as this team wants to say that your parents and your community broadly want you to do these things, they don't respond to the intuition that we explained at first and at second, which is that parents are time poor, parents can be incredibly complacent, but importantly, that there are a huge amount of countervailing narratives and social structures that pressure young people to do things that are incredibly bad. It's like Andrew Tate on Instagram, to which they say, now Andrew Tate's just gonna whip you against the deep state, not responding to the fact that we preemptively stop children from falling into these traps, preemptively make people far less far less susceptible to narratives that oppress people. 3 questions in this speech. The first is on politicization, the second on education, and third is on the quality of students. This team says that governments, on the first question, are going to mold this teaching to shape their voter base to be, I suppose, susceptible to their political will. A few responses. The first is just to explain, this obviously isn't true in a vast majority of instances. And the first is that policy is in most countries and functioning democracies done by a bureaucracy that is separate to the government and separate to school boards. So the curriculum is set and imposed by Department of Education. The second thing that we explain is that you are likely to receive resistance from admin and educators and different coalitions between state and local and federal government. And they say that this means that you're going to defund these institutions. But that's actually the reason that you're likely to get negotiations on what values you teach in the first place. The third reason is that children and education are incredibly sensitive to narratives about corruption, which explains why backlash would be incredibly large if they did politicize the education. And they say that it means that you're going to be defunded, but the obvious preemption to defunding education is just making it more value neutral in the first place. Fourthly, we explain that most governments, silly response. Fifthly, we explain that elections are often decided by swing voters, who would obviously get incredibly angry if you did politicize these types of values in education, because they are individuals who don't have a political alignment or loyalty to a specific party, which explains that if you're the Republicans trying to capture swing voters and now you're teaching values of homophobia in every single school, that obviously pisses people off and they won't vote for you in the next election. The second thing I would explain is that obviously governments like people to be incredibly educated for the reasons that they identify. It's really good for your economy and productivity. People being well educated often makes them happy. It makes parents happy. Therefore, even if you did believe that this is going to lead to the defunding of education, that's the reason that governments are likely to do this in incredibly value-neutral ways. I'll be charitable though. Even if this is true, it's just obviously symmetric, right? Like if there are instances in which the government has total access to control of a curriculum, if there are instances in which private institutions are so conservative and religious, they obviously do the same moralization on their side of the debate as well, because it's easy to falsify things like history, falsify things like civics and politics, and teach people the same values and narratives that this team denigrates as bad, like rightly so I suppose, which means that obviously all of the bad values that get taught under our side of the debate, I would presume occur under their side as well. And also when they're like, well, the public's super skeptical of the government and the education system, obviously that is symmetric in cases where governments do exercise a lot of control over the education system. But we would probably flip that somewhat marginally and explain that people get far more angry when you teach them about falsified narratives of history that had personally affected them and their lineages, which explains why you get more backlash to falsified education under their side of the debate. Flip this in a second way though, because even if you believe that there are even some neutral values taught in these education and Republican systems or whatever, such as empathy, etc., that explains why students are far more resistant to the bad moralization that occurs under our side as well. But also, we explain that there's an incentive for governments to teach students those types of neutral good values in some instances as well, because governments typically like cohesion and harmony and students who care about each other, because that makes their job a far lot easier. Note that all of their defunding outcomes are downstream of you believing that the politicization occurs in the first place. If it doesn't, their one path to victory is dead in the water. Secondly, on education, what do they say? Teachers are going to decrease because there's a supply increase in teachers, therefore their wage decreases. Firstly, we are fine to take that we are fine to cop their pay staying the same if it means you get more teachers, because now more children have access to teachers. But we flip this, explain it's far easier to unionize when you have more teachers. The second thing that they say, a bit more compellingly, is that traditional education teaches you skills that jobs require. And we explain that there is still a baseline level that we are able to meet under our side of the debate, but we actually flip it and explain that if you're more engaged in education, notably people who are traditionally disadvantaged by an academic system are now more engaged in the baseline level of education because they actually enjoy turning up to school. That explains that more people meet the baseline threshold required for you to then exit school and enter things like university. And then we were fine to take the trade-off of those students potentially being less specialized in specific classes than they would be under the counterfactual. We're okay with you not knowing calculus if you can do basic arithmetic, because you often specialize in specific industries in university anyway. So if we get more people at the baseline that allow them to get into university in the first place, that flips their analysis and explains why economic productivity grows so much more under our side of the debate. The second thing that they say on this is that parents can teach morality, but they can't do academic teaching, therefore their benefit is more mutually exclusive and greater. The thing that we explain is that parents often don't teach morality, even if they could, because firstly, they feel as if they can delay morality and put it off, but they don't feel that way about academic teaching, because there are specific developmental deadlines you need to meet for those types of things, but not for morality. But secondly, parents don't have the guidelines for things like morality, but it's far easier for them to access that in terms of academic education. But thirdly, we explain that that's not even responsive to the counteractive things that we explain exist, such as social media and increasing norms for individualism that make students worse people. But the second thing that we would explain is education is actually more accessible at home and stuff. Firstly, because you have resources online, but secondly, because it's often at a level that's a lot simpler than what your parents understand, so they're better able to help you than this team would suggest. The final thing that they say, it's so much more time consuming to check in on students when you're doing this type of education, which is fine if true, because they just concede that teachers increase in supply, so we're okay with them taking up a bit more time. Will you flip it and explain that our activities are far more generalizable, which means you check in less. So for example, teamwork and volunteering, etc. Everyone receives the same moral lesson from those things, but under academic learning, you actually have to spend so much more time engaging with students on an individual level. We provide multiple mechanisms for engagement then that don't get a response. The first is that students are better able to succeed under our side of the debate because the threshold to success is far lower. The second is that it's more fun and you spend more time outside and stuff, and students like going to school when it's fun. And then the third is that teachers are far able to adapt to specific classes rather than responding to an imposed curriculum that students potentially feel incredibly disengaged from. And their only response to engagement is like, well, moralizing is boring, but we explain to no response that teachers do it in an incredibly good way. Wait this then. The most vulnerable students become far more engaged in education only under psych negative, and those are the ones we cared about the most because they're systemically locked out from success under the affirmative side of the debate. Finally then, on making students better people. They say that these are bad values, but that's obviously downstream of you believing that they're politicized and bad in the first place. And if that is the case, then that obviously occurs under their side as well. So the unique benefit we got was the increase in yield in positive and neutral values that make students much better people. We explain that it makes them kinder, more helpful, better voters, more likely to contribute to social movements, more likely to contribute to their community, to which they say that's speculative, but it's not, because you get students out volunteering in their community, they enjoy it more, they care more about these social issues. We benefited people at a far greater scale, and people who are far more vulnerable, never been prouder to engage.
All right, hi everyone. Thank you all very much for the debate. We all enjoyed that debate. I think it was a pretty solid start to round one of Easters, and teams were very happy with their performance. I think you guys are both very strong teams, so we'll both do well. We'll just general feedback, announce the result, and then go through the reasons for the result. The first thing I want to say in general feedback is I would like a bit more of the flip side of this debate. It's a bit more discussion of, it does come up at times, but a bit more discussion around the academics and the side we're losing in this debate and what the impacts are around that. Because I think it's touched on, but could have been delved into a lot more from both sides of the debate today. The second thing is I think a backlash as an argument is thrown around by both teams today, but I think needs to be fleshed out a lot more from both teams. I think it's just saying backlash, I think is insufficient. I think teams need to detail who is doing it, what it looks like what is actually involved in that backlash, and something through why it's likely to be effective. And I think you need more detail about the things they're doing and who they're doing it to explain why that person's behavior is going to change as a result of the backlash that is actually occurring. I think that would have helped detail the arguments a little bit more and make them a little bit stronger. I think the last thing is that teams could have done a little bit more to engage more charitably in each other's best characterizations. I think there's plenty of rebuttal today, but I think at times the sort of the best versions of each other's cases are left a little bit untackled at times in response. All right, in terms of the results, then we thought it was quite a close debate and quite a good debate, and we eventually came to a consensus decision with awarding the debate to side affirmative. Congratulations. There was a bit of discrepancy on the panel around the prioritisation of issues and what was important and what was decisive. So I would advise talking to both panelists and trainees to get extra thoughts as well. But in terms of the decision, let's go through the three issues now. I think the first one, and probably the most decisive one for me, is the question of how will this be taught, because I think that the way it ends up in the classroom is actually quite instructive then for what impact it has on schools and students as a second and third issue. So let's start with that one of how it will be taught. I think the difficult thing here is I think negative does do a good job of proving how it could be taught. And I think in some cases the stuff they raise about when it if it is taught in the way they describe, I think the benefits flow through quite well. And I think it is possible in some cases it could be taught at a very low level of like having basic morality or doing good things for your community, etc. But I think what AFSL to get up on here in this issue is by describing, I think, in a lot more different contexts, why it is likely that sort of the freedom that a holistic education gives you does allow for more interference in the curriculum and does allow for things to be more politicized or changed based on like politics or ideology or culture or context, etc., and that the broad set of values could be bad. I think they give a few examples about why that context is likely to be so key and how it's likely to be manipulated, giving examples around India or South Korea or Texas, etc. I think all those sort of help to demonstrate an idea that the way this is taught is going to be not necessarily a neutral way, but a way that does attempt to put agendas into what people believe. We get a couple of responses here from negative. I think the first and unfortunate thing is at times the negative conception of what they're teaching does shift down the bench, which I think undermines and weakens the argument a little bit, because at times it's talking about things like abortion as one of the moral things we're discussing that we hear at first negative, which I think feeds more into affirmative characterization. This is likely to be politicized issues that is going to upset people and make things worse, and then walks back a little bit in later speeches to being more basic morality stuff. I think what all that does is help actually prove to affirmative's point, there's like a wide variety of what would be acceptable, what people could think, like how this would be taught, which suggests there isn't likely to be that much of a baseline. And the more it gets lesser and lesser, the less imperative or burden we think we see to fix a lot of the issues that affirmative sets up. So the more it's just about basic level things about doing good things for charity or being polite, etc. I think that doesn't help address the sort of higher burdens around social media, and Andrew will touch on in a second, that the affirmative wants, the negative wants to set up from the start. I think the last thing that, also the next thing rather, is I think that affirmative has responses here that I think suggest that like what is also, what like giving stuff to community or charity is also particularly vague, and they illustrate how things like that, even on the more mild level of what Negative's talking about, can still be interpreted in ways that are different and harmful in certain contexts. And they give a useful example around things like South Korea, where a community-minded focus might, well, it's actually very detrimental to the individual because it buys into narratives around overworking and etc., which create particular harms here. The last couple of things I want to touch on here from negative in terms of responses to this is first they say there'll be backlash from teachers and staff if it is bad. As to the general feedback, I wanted a lot more on what this is and why it's effective, like what is actually happening in this backlash to push this change against. I think that's also particularly crucial in the sort of content. So that's the next response. The next response I give is like, well, it's done by rational people. It's not done by like crazy people. It's done by people who are experts, they're logical, they think this stuff through. I think the problem I have here is that I think that even if they are like rational and logical, they're coming from contexts which don't think they're acting in ways that are radical or outside that bound. So I think what I've able to show is that like in a context where you've got a deeply religious context in the Texas example, etc., people are still acting rationally there. I think there's enough from negatives to why sort of rationality and separation breaks away from the cultural and the context around that means people don't act in that way anyway. And I think also they have issues it's also about the perception of how this is working, even if it is in actuality not as radical or as politicized as we talked about, but the perception of it becomes more important in the second clash. The last thing I think we have here from negative that comes out at third, which is I think a good margin narrowing response, is this idea that, well, if these places are so radical and so politicized, ideologicized, etc., they're likely to do this anyway because they have incentives to push the same material anyway. I think what this does do is kind of mitigate maybe some of the worst examples from affirmative, but I think the setup of the curriculums gives way more license for this to occur than it otherwise would in a curriculum focused more solely on academics. So I think that while that maybe mitigates a little bit, I think this type of education, the holistic education, does give you more scope to do that. So on the end of the first issue then, I think we're at the position where it's likely to be taught in a way that is not necessarily as good as negative ones, and that leads on to a few flow-on harms to the next couple of issues. The second one then being impact on schools. This had more varying views on the panel. The first thing I want to talk about here is the funding element. So based on what Affirmative tells us in the first issue, it tells us that then funding is likely to decrease as groups become angry or resentful as about what is being taught or how it's being taught, given it's so subjective about the moralist types of education. I think that what they add well here is this idea of like whether it is actual or perceived doesn't make a whole bit much of difference. So even if it is as good as negative says, there'll still be a perception that's very easily sold by media outlets who have agendas, etc., and politicians that will push that it's actually being done in a far more radical way. And then when you have a focus that is anything but academics, it is likely to incur that kind of outcome. So we get two responses from negative. The first sort of group of responses is just targeting the how it will be taught. So it's like it will be taught differently, therefore the funding won't drop. But we've already dealt with that one. The second one here is that there will that there's no incentives there's no incentives for the government to do it this badly because they still want to access funding and they want to two responses. One, that like the funding won't be cut because it's the bodies are similar who are setting the curriculums and who are doing the funding. I think Aristotle set up why there's a lot of different funding sources. So even if one source was happy to fund to do this, doesn't necessarily mean that parents or federal governments or local governments or whoever is separate to that is one that's likely to continue doing that funding. And I think they're able to show that sometimes curricular setting bodies are different to funding bodies, which can mean that the capacity to continue that funding is weakened if groups are angry at each other. I think I point to examples of Texas and the US where things that are already happening about threats to defund or actual defunding where politicization is getting involved. I think the second response that we get is like, well, governments don't have an active incentive to want the education system to fail, so don't want to defund these things. But I think the response we get from Affirmative that like, if these groups are teaching things that are moralistically different, like the fear of threats to our children is likely to be more powerful as an incentive to try and prevent that or change that. I would have liked a bit more clarity on that from Affirmative. I think there's enough there, particularly in the first speech and carried through in responses that sort of pushes that over for me. So I think on the funding issue, I think as a result of this, you're likely to get worse funding for schools. The second element of the impact on schools is one on teachers. This is the stuff that comes out at first Affirmative that I'm a bit unconvinced by from Affirmative about the supply-demand element of this issue, because the idea being that, well, more people can teach it now, so the money goes down, so less people will do it. But if less people are doing it, then the supply presumably decreases, so the price goes back up again. So it becomes a bit unclear exactly how this teaching mechanism is working. The negative tries to flip this and say, well, actually, because it's easy to teach now, we get more teachers in, and that is a benefit to having more staff around. But I think as we get to in the third issue, just having more staff isn't necessarily good if it is coming at the cost of like the academics, and that's what this focus is drawing away from. And we, I think after some Wayne said we would prefer to have better teachers focusing more on the academics. Which brings me to the third issue there, about what are the impacts on students here. Firstly, on the academic issue here, so I think that Affirmative does at parts of their case point to the idea that like this is an opportunity cost, time that's taken away from other academic pursuits. You can't necessarily be caught up at university, and it's still a value to learning in school. I think it necessarily has to be some sort of cost from negative, taking time away from doing that. There is some attempts to weigh this. It's like saying we'd be better off having a more moral person who gives more to charity than necessarily one who does a whole bunch of calculus. I think I would have needed a bit more of that weighing, because I think that relies upon the idea that this is also being taught well in the ways that negative wants that weighing to work. I think absent that first step, the weighing becomes less powerful in that step. On academics and students, though, back to before I started that tangent, the response we get from Neg is like, well, school should also be something that is fun, that students enjoy and want to go to, but also reduces stress. There's a lot of stress-related harms to students that occur from being in a more academic sense. I think there's a good response from AF that just says that given that there's still marks and tests at the end of semesters and the end of school before going to university, that stress is likely to be one that is symmetric either way on those students, if not made it worse, because they don't have less time with academics. I think we needed more responses to that from negative. So I'm willing to believe at this point the stress doesn't change a huge degree, and you actually do receive some degree of academic loss here. We're trying to balance it up, and I've already covered a little bit of the weighing earlier about there's a good education that negative tells us that comes from this, about making you a more moral person that makes you want to give more to charity. I think they have an interesting sort of problem they're trying to solve as well, where we're in a context of like social media and Andrew Tate's and more individualistic communities that we need to combat and push against. I think I've started to get this in two ways. I think the first one, and like a fine but not the strongest response, is the idea that parents can also teach this stuff. I think we need a little bit more specific about the skills and etc. that parents are giving us that means that they can do this. But I think the second and better response is that like it is unlikely to work in lots of cases. Like it is like if we start to combat these sorts of things, and the Andrew Tate's of the world are just likely to get more combative and tell us that it is wrong as well. I did like the idea from Neg that we hear at third, that like what we're trying to do is actually preempt that, so get in before they become Andrew Tatefied and stop them from buying into that. I guess the problem I have here is that it's asking us to believe a conception of what this moralistic teaching looks like that is still, I don't think, proven or locked in the debate. So it's hard for me to credit that response as being successful in getting over it. To the extent, I think, at the end of this issue, again, some varying opinions on the level of this from the panel. There is some benefit of like maybe more people are more likely to go to nursing homes, or maybe more likely to do that general community stuff at the end of it. I think it's a big question of just how much is that likely to happen just because of the education system, and is that worth all the other conceptions and problems and harms we've had around the funding and around the way it'll be taught and around the academics. But I don't think that is enough to weigh up against everything else we've been told, and that's ultimately why then Affirmative is able to take that issue on students and therefore take the debate as a whole. Hope that made sense. As I said, very happy to chat to any three of us, but well done on the debate, and best luck